Hello, students, and welcome to class. Today, we are going to begin our next major religion of South Asia, which is the religion of Jainism. Jainism is concerned with this term that we learned earlier with Hinduism, and that term is moksha, or liberation from this cycle of birth and death, samsara. So let's go ahead, and the key to this is escaping samsara is the practice of non-violence. Let's take a look at a little bit of an intro video on Jainism.
Jainism is one of the four major religious traditions that comes out of India, along with Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. And there are approximately 6 million Jains in the world today, the majority of whom live in India. And Jainism is contemporaneous with Buddhism. Its founder, Mahavira, was a contemporary of Buddha and lived in India 2,500 years ago. Whereas Buddhism believes in no soul and no God, Hinduism believes in a soul and a God, Jainism believes in a soul but no God. And for Jains, the goal of life is to become a Tirthankara, to become an enlightened being. And there are many different ways to do this in the Jain tradition. But Jainism has historically been characterized by non-violence, by a core concept called ahimsa, which Mahatma Gandhi incorporated into his non-violent campaign against British rule in India. So Jains are probably the most non-violent people in the world. They don't eat meat. In fact, they don't eat a lot of roots that grow into the ground as well. And if you're a Jain monk, you won't even wear clothing because clothing is made from fiber and you don't want to destroy plants. You'll walk around with a mask covering your nose so you don't accidentally inhale any insects or any bugs. And at the end of a Jain monk or nun's life, oftentimes it's characterized by starving or fasting until one's death, so as not to bring about any more violence as you transition into the next phase of your existence. For many people in India, Jains are really the exemplars of how to live a non-violent life, and the Jain tradition has influenced Hindus and Buddhists accordingly. Because of this injunction against violence, many Jains are merchants, and they work in fields that don't require them to do anything that they would consider violent. And so, in that regard, Jains are a very prosperous community within India because historically they've been part of the merchant caste.
Okay, so we're gonna start today. This is part one of a two-part lecture introducing us to the world of Jainism. Let's go ahead and get started with our presentation. Okay, to start things off, let's take a look at what we see in this image. This is the swastika, which in Germany during the Nazi era would come to symbolize something very different, but in different Asian religions it has more, peaceful meanings. This can mean for example, good luck or peace or salvation. In the Jains, they see it as a symbol of the entire universe. Now let's take our focus down to this hand. The hand is saying stop. Now, what kind of shape, what kind of geometric shape do we see inside the hand? Well, we see a circle, and that circle symbolizes samsara, the cycle of birth and death, this endless cycle of reincarnation. And the hand is signifying stop samsara. And it's telling us how to do that. And what does it say? It says in the middle here, this is in an Indian script called Devanagari. It says ahimsa. Ahimsa, that's a very important word you're going to hear again and again. It means non-violence. Ahimsa is the pathway to stopping birth and death. the cycles of reincarnation, because through ahimsa, through nonviolence, according to Jainism, one is able to purify and get rid of this negative karma that keeps us bound in samsara, the cycle of birth and death, cyclic existence. So ahimsa, nonviolence, that's the core principle and concept of Jainism. So what is Jainism? It's an ancient religion of South Asia, over 2,500 years old. Many say that this was around the same time that we get Buddhism. So this is the 5th, 6th century before Common Era. Right now, it's a very, very old religion, but it's fairly small population-wise. Modern day South Asia, there's about 4 million people. But this is a very, very influential minority in South Asia in terms of humanitarian work, in terms of wealth. Much of the tax revenue, say in modern India, comes from the Jain community. The Jains will not work in areas like farming or hunting, occupations that create violence. Instead, they go towards more the merchants and the business area, often donating large portions of their income to charities. The basic core society of Jainism, and we're going to see this again in Buddhism, is a fourfold society, meaning you have 4 different categories. So you have men who have taken a vow of celibacy. We call these men monks. You have women who have taken a vow of celibacy and renounced the world. These are nuns. You then have practitioners who have not taken the vow of celibacy, the vow to give up, the family life, and these are laymen and lay women. 2 major sects. We have the Shvetambara Jains and the Digambara Jains. The most notable difference between the 2 different sects of Jainism is that the Digambara Jains, the monks do not wear any clothes. The Digambara are, that men believe that wearing clothing can harm insects and harm other beings. And so a Jain monk in this particular sect will often walk around nude. This other sect, the Jain monks and nuns, will wear a white cloth. They will not walk around nude. Again and again, to understand Jainism, we have to go back to the core central concept of nonviolence. Ahimsa paramo dharma. Non-violence is the highest form of religious conduct. Now, dharma, we saw this word in Hinduism to mean duty, often associated with caste and stage of life. But the word dharma will start to have different meanings as the history of South Asia develops. In the Jain context, dharma refers to the path of liberation from samsara, and that path is ahimsa, non-violence, at a physical level, mental level, and spiritual level. So Jains will emphasize non-violence as the path of purifying the soul of karma. So non-violence purifies all the negative, nasty karma that keeps us cycling in these birth and death. Through non-violence, one can escape samsara, and we call this state of liberation. Often you'll hear one of 2 terms in the South Asian context, nirvana or moksha. So the Jainism is a path to moksha via the practice of non-violence. According to Jainism, 24 great teachers over the span of the life of the universe have come down and taught this core path, this path of nonviolence. These teachers are called Tirthankara, which is a bridge builder. And what they're building a bridge is between is a bridge over the ocean of samsara. The cycle of birth and death, samsara, is often described as an ocean to indicate how beings are drowning in suffering and death and rebirth. Well, these 24 great teachers came down and taught the path to freeing oneself from it. So the 24 Tirthankaras. Now let's talk a little bit more about the Jain contribution to South Asia, and a little bit indirectly about how maybe Jainism has had somewhat of an influence here in the United States. And take a look at these two individuals down here. Can anyone identify who they are? We have Mahatma Gandhi, who's a great intellectual influence over Martin Luther King Jr. Mahatma Gandhi is deeply influenced by Jain ideals of nonviolence. So the Jains have, contributions in art, literature, and architecture. The Jains hold libraries that have collections of all religions, not just Jain religious books. Jains are active in humanitarian work, interreligious harmony, and education. And then significant economic contributions. Much of the tax revenue in modern-day India comes from Jain enterprises. And above all, it's this core philosophy of nonviolence. Gandhi will take this core philosophy, and so Gandhi was born into a Hindu Vaishnava family, but he's influenced by Jain renouncers. Gandhi is a major leader of India's independence movement, the independence from colonial Britain. He emphasized a oneness of all religions, and this was to create a sense of peace and non-violence among all religions. So this is kind of the point I was raising earlier. Gandhi is very much influenced by this Jain idea of ahimsa, and he believes that non-violent protest and non-violent civil disobedience, these are pathways to overcoming injustice in the world. He calls his core philosophy satyagraha, or truth force. And this idea is if someone is doing harm to us, someone is oppressing us, someone is doing a grave injustice, well, that person is also oppressed. They're oppressed by their negative thoughts, they're oppressed by negative karma, and they're oppressed by ignorance. The purpose of protest, we can think a lot about protests happening in our country and what we're trying to achieve through those protests. For Gandhi, you have to liberate both yourself and the person who's oppressing you. So it's using the power of nonviolence, the power of a good example to stand up to injustice in a way that those who are committing injustice, they become transformed. So protest is a form of love that is intended to create justice in the world. Gandhi's ideas about nonviolent protests will influence Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Gandhi is a controversial figure. While he's often celebrated as a founding figure of India, and his views on nonviolence have influenced thinkers and activists around the world, and they continue to do so, he was also known to do certain things, like he would sleep nude with a bunch of women around him. He saying that he would not touch them. This was a test of his restraint. Okay, but now let's go back here. So our symbol. This is ahimsa in the center of the circle, and indicating stopping samsara through nonviolence. All beings are drowning. They're drowning in samsara. Oh, look at us. We're just not happy. The cycle of birth and death. To escape the drowning, Jainism has created a figure known as the Tirthankara, or rather they teach about a figure called the Tirthankaras. These are great liberated beings who come into the world and they show the path leading out of suffering. So here you can see an image of individuals drowning, but they're going towards, this is one of the Tirthankaras, sitting on a lotus flower. So there is a pathway out of suffering. The Tirthankaras are ford builders or bridge builders that guide Jains for crossing and overcoming the ocean of samsara. So Jains are followers of the Jinnas. Jinnas and Tirthankaras have this are the same. Jinna means victor. These are individuals who have gained victory over karma, victory over samsara. There is no central god in Jainism. There are lesser gods that one can worship. There's a polytheistic universe, but the highest beings are not gods. And we'll see this also in Buddhism. The highest beings are enlightened beings. And the Jains call these enlightened beings Jinnas or Tirthankaras. Right? And so this is kind of the definition of a Tirthankara, those whose teachings constitute bridges for crossing the ocean of samsara. And the Jains believe that 24 Jinnas, there's not one Tirthankara, but 24 Jinnas or Tirthankaras have come into our universe. Mahavira is the name of the last Jinna who came into this world to teach this fundamental practice of nonviolence. So we're going to skip a little bit of the axial age. We're going to look a little bit at the historical context of Jainism. Jainism develops around the same time. It's a cousin of another religion, which is Buddhism. This is between the 6th to 8th century before Common Era. This is an age of empires, an age of urbanization, and an age of renunciation. So great changes are taking place on the Indian subcontinent. In this context, you'll have a group called the Shramanas. These are the seekers, the ascetics. They're giving up life in the cities, life in the family to go out and seek a higher spiritual calling. You have two groups. You have an orthodox group. This is a group that will accept the authority of the Vedas. And out of this group comes the scriptures that we learned about a few weeks ago called the Upanishads. Now you're going to have another group that will reject the teachings of the Vedas and will reject the authority of the Vedas. This will include the Jains, the Ajivikas, and Buddhists. And we'll learn about Buddhism as our next religion in a few weeks. All of these groups are in contact with one another and are collaborating and sharing ideas. And they all have certain beliefs. First is a belief that this cycle of birth, death, and suffering that we call samsara, that this samsara is driven by the power of our past actions that determine when we're going to die, where we're going to be reborn, whether we're going to be a human, an animal, living in a hell realm, living among divine beings. But it's karma that drives samsara. The renouncer traditions like Jainism and Buddhism viewed the world, the earth, as fundamentally a place of suffering. We have a belief of asceticism. This means to really give something up. But here, ascetics are those individuals who have given up pursuit of the sensual pleasures, and no longer pursuing the pleasures of fine food, of a luxurious abode to live in, of sexual pleasure. Giving these up and seeking a truth within. And by giving up these external attachments, the ascetics believe that they're able to cultivate an inner power, an inner fire called, we use the term tapas for this inner fire. Meditation, which means mind training. So around the 6th century before Common Era, the Jains and the Buddhists, they're practicing meditation. They're practicing yoga, which we learned about a few weeks ago, trying to understand, different energy points in the body, which is the chakras. And we talked about, remember, there's 2 major divisions. We have one group which accepts the Vedas, and we'll go ahead and call that group the Hindus, even though they did not identify as such at the time. And then that's the Orthodox group. The heterodox group, these are those who are rejecting the Vedas. All right, and the key beliefs about Jainism. First, we have this idea of non-absolutism or many-sidedness, anekantavada, and then non-violence. And we're going to look more in detail at those. The first of non-absolutism or many-sidedness has the illustration of blind individuals trying to figure out what exactly is an elephant. Well, one individual grabs the tusk and says it's like a big snake. Another says it's a tree. One's grabbing the ears and says it's a sheath of leather. One grabs the tail and says, no, it's a fuzzy mouse. Well, they're all right and they're all wrong. They all have a partial picture of the truth. That's the Jain view of all religions, that different religions have different perspectives on the truth. And thus, we should all get along with each other. Going back to the core, how it is, Jainism is a teaching of nonviolence. And this gets us into the figure of Mahavira. You can read about him in page 162 to 165. He is the most current Tirthankara to come into the world and teach this path of nonviolence, that as a means of liberating oneself from karma and thus becoming free from the cycle of birth and death or samsara. Let's meet a little, let's take a few minutes to meet Mahavira. Okay, and remember, Mahavira is the 24th in a line of these bridge builders, these Tirthankaras who build a bridge to overcoming samsara or suffering. Sorry, here a little bit of technical issues here. Here we go.
According to Jain tradition, there have been 24 Tirthankaras, known as all-knowing teachers who have built a pathway from the cycle of suffering, samsara, to an eternal realm of liberation, moksha. The last Tirthankara is the most famous and is regarded by some as the founder of the Jain religion. His name was Mahavira, meaning great hero, and he lived from 599 to 527 BCE. The Western scholars place his birth and death within the 5th century proper. There is much uncertainty surrounding his life and work, and it is difficult to know for certain which details are historically accurate and which are merely the result of hagiography accredited over time. His story, nevertheless, is a fascinating one and says much about his influence. According to Jain legend, Mahavira first occupied the womb of a pious Brahmin named Devanata. Because she had wondrous dreams, she and her husband knew that this was a special child. However, in a strange twist of fate, orchestrated by the god Indra, Mahavira was switched over to another woman named Trisala, who was the queen of the Kshatriya caste. Interestingly, her original child, a baby girl, was switched over to Devanata. So sweet was this baby Mahavira in the womb that he didn't move so as not to cause injury or pain to his birth mother, but this caused some fear in her because he was so still. When Mahavira was born, the universe rejoiced, and he was honored by gods, goddesses, and angelic beings. Indra struck a divine bell so all can worship this radiant child. Indra was so pleased by the appearance of Mahavira that he lifted the child upwards to heaven so he could be righteously honored. While in heaven, there was a festival where he was bathed and adorned. When Mahavira returns back to the earthly kingdom of his father, everybody rejoices because everybody experiences great wealth and fortune. Because of this, they named him Vardhanama, which means prosperous. As a young boy, Mahavira was playing a game of tag with his childhood companions when a large cobra tried to attack, but Mahavira flung the hissing snake away from the boys and away from harm. Another demon, disguised as a little boy, tried to deceive Mahavira while playing leapfrog, growing super tall in order to attack him, but Mahavira made him shrink down by blows until the demon begged for mercy. This is how Vardhamana became known as the great hero, Mahavira. When Mahavira was a young boy of 8 years old studying at school, Indra took on the teacher's form to show everyone that Mahavira was himself the great Rishi. Mahavira grew up as a young, handsome man, but he refused to participate in hunting since he believed that we should all treat others as we wish to be treated ourselves. Mahavira honored his parents' wishes and got married to Yashoda and had one daughter named Priya Darshana. After his parents died, at 28 years old, Mahavira sought to renounce the world and to seek enlightenment. To do such, he asked permission from his brother, Nartavadana. Mahavira explained to his family and kingdom that he must follow a higher destiny than merely storing worldly riches. As Mahavira got ready to renounce his kingdom and prepare for renunciation, he opened up the palace doors and gave everything away. After his sacred bath, Mahavira was carried out on a beautiful carriage in a parade through the town. In front of the Ashoka tree, Mahavira takes off all his jewels and pulls out of his hair in 5 fistfuls. Indra then appears and provided him with a beautiful white shawl to cover his naked body. Mahavira in his radiance was attractive to all, as he gave off an enchanting aroma of sandalwood paste. In the beginning of Mahavira's journey, a poor Brahmin asked for a gift from him, and Mahavira offered him a part of his beautiful white cloth that was bestowed on him by Indra, but the other part ripped on a thorny branch and was too taken by the Brahmin. Mahavira was now completely naked. When Mahavira was asked to watch a farmer's bulls, Mahavira was in deep meditation and unaware of the request, only to be beaten by the disgruntled man. The cows returned peacefully, and Indra appeared to Mahavira to protect him, and the farmer repented. As he meditated in a temple, evil spirits tried to torture him, but eventually realized their wrong ways and left him undisturbed. Mahavira came upon a cobra that bit his foot, but Mahavira reminded him of his past life, that he used to be an ascetic, and thus he liberated him from his bad karma. On a ferry crossing rough seas created by an evil spirit, while everyone panicked, Mahavira remained calm. Other demons also tried to assail him, including his wife from a previous life who was envious of him. When Mahavira was on a 5-month fast, he had very strict restrictions about how he could break it, and a young woman met the conditions and offered him a basket of beans. Mahavira met his severest test when a deranged farmer put sharpened pappus grass and shoved them into each ear hole. The next day a physician saw Mahavira in this miserable condition, and the pappus grass was removed. For 12.5 years, Mahavira practiced severe austerities, and because of this practice, he eradicated all of his past karmas, and a brilliant white aura surrounded him from then on. With complete knowledge, Mahavira became a Jina, one who has conquered the onslaught of samsara. In celebration of his Jina status, the gods planted an Ashoka tree, which grew in full size immediately, and this is where Mahavira taught the community his message of nonviolence. 11 philosophers renowned for their erudition tried to challenge Mahavira, but were unsuccessful. The leader of the group, Gautama, became one of his greatest disciples. After 24 years of teaching, Mahavira was confronted by an old disciple, Gosalaka, who had gained supernatural powers and who tried to use evil curses on him. but it backfired and he died instead. At 72 years old, Mahavira gave his last sermon for 2 days and 2 nights and reaffirmed the 5 principles of Jainism: nonviolence, truth, non-theft, self-control, and detachment from worldly possessions. As Mahavira was on his deathbed, he reminded them that his spirit was immortal and that there was no reason to be sad. He died in the year 527 BCE. Gautama cried at the death of his master Mahavira, but remembered that he should not be attached to the body of his beloved teacher, and immediately became enlightened himself and continued the teachings of Mahavira.
Okay, so that was our introduction to the founding figure of modern day Jainism, an individual called Mahavira. And we'll go more into him, his life story, and teachings next class. In the meantime, stay safe, stay well, and stay tuned.